Hello and welcome to Talking Tolkien and Chapter 6 of Frodo's Journey. We join the Fellowship on the night of December 25th, the night they left Rivendell, and climb up the high moor away from the home of Elrond Half-Elven. We know on this first night that they travelled through the night and reached the Ford of Bruinen, so we will do the same and head down the high moor, looking back out across the Trollshaws that we saw in Chapter 4. I mentioned this back at the very start of these videos, but because it's about to become an important part of the journey, I think it's worth reiterating this now, and that's about issues of scale. So I'm using the game world here of Lord of the Rings Online to replicate and illustrate Frodo's journey, as to my mind it's the only real visual representation of Middle-earth that's ever been created that's detailed enough to allow an accurate recreation of the journey to happen, like we're doing here. But obviously there are limitations to that. As the party are about to travel along the Bruinen towards Hollin, in the book they took a couple of weeks to do this. To put that in context, it took Frodo and the Hobbit 6 days to travel from Hobbiton to Bree via the Old Forest, and that journey took me 2 full videos to cover. Whilst rather than spend hours and hours of in-game time travelling across nondescript valleys, the game wisely condenses this whole area. So I'll warn you now that we're about to travel 2 weeks of Fellowship time in about 2 minutes, okay? One of the reasons I wanted to do this series was to try and represent the timescales that Frodo took to give a bit of perspective to that. So I'll try and illustrate the distance he covered, though it's going to be impractical and virtually impossible, not to mention tedious, to do this on a daily basis. So I'll just do it when it seems appropriate. For anyone interested, I'll add a summary of exactly how far they went each day, and I'll put that in the information box for each video, just for anyone who wants to refer to that. We can see above us the pinpricks of stars in the night sky, which itself is accurate to what Tolkien devised, as he wrote about a number of constellations which can also be found in the night sky in the Northern Hemisphere. I was so impressed by this that it inspired me to make a short video dedicated to these constellations, which you can find at this link. So as we head down now towards the river, there isn't a path and it's quite easy to get lost. This is accurate to what Tolkien says about Rivendell, as it was established by Elrond as a refuge from Sauron in the Second Age after the destruction of the elven land of Eregion, which oddly enough is where we're heading in this chapter. Elrond was then able to protect the area through the use of his elven ring of power, Vilya, which has been given to him by Gil-galad, and which gave Rivendell a kind of timeless protection against the ravages of the rest of the world. This is what Tolkien says about this part of the journey. At the Ford of Bruinen, they left the road and turning southwards, went on narrow paths along the folded lands. Their purpose was to hold this course west of the mountains for many miles and days. The country was much rougher and more barren than in the green vale of the great river in Wilderland on the other side of the range, and their going would be slow, but they hoped in this way to escape the notice of unfriendly eyes. The spies of Sauron had hitherto seldom been seen in this empty country, and the paths were little known except to the people of Rivendell. Gandalf walked in front, and with him went Aragorn, who knew this land even in the dark. The others were in file behind, and Legolas, whose eyes were keen, was the rear guard. The first part of their journey was hard and dreary, and Frodo remembered little of it save the wind. For many sunless days an icy blast came from the mountains in the east, and no garment seemed able to keep out its searching fingers. Though the company was well clad, they seldom felt warm, either moving or at rest. They slept uneasily during the middle of the day in some hollow of the land, or hidden under the tangled thorn bushes that grew in thickets in many places. In the late afternoon they were roused by the watch and took their chief meal, cold and cheerless as a rule, for they could seldom risk the lighting of a fire. In the evening they went on again, always as nearly southward as they could find a way. At first it seemed to the hobbits that although they walked and stumbled until they were weary, they were creeping forward like snails and getting nowhere. Each day the land looked much the same as it had the day before. Yet, steadily, the mountains were drawing nearer. South of Rivendell, they rose ever higher and bent westwards, and about the feet of the main range there was tumbled an ever wider land of bleak hills and deep valleys filled with turbulent waters. Paths were few and winding, and led them often only to the edge of some sheer fall or down into treacherous swamps. So here as we stand outside Garbutt's cottage on the bank of the river, we can look up here towards the heights that lead to the land that men call Hollin, which is a land that has a long history in Middle-earth, going back to the time when it was known as Eregion, where Noldorin elves dwelt during the Second Age. This was also the land of the elven smiths who, with Celebrimbor, made the rings of power for Sauron, who disguised himself to trick the elves. They had been a fortnight on the way when the weather changed. The wind suddenly fell and then veered round to the south. The swift flowing clouds lifted and melted away and the sun came out pale and bright. There came a cold, clear dawn at the end of a long, stumbling night march. The travellers reached a low ridge crowned with ancient holly trees whose grey-green trunks seemed to have been built out of the very stone of the hills. Their dark leaves shone and their berries glowed red in the light of the rising sun. Away in the south, Frodo could see the dim shapes of lofty mountains that seemed now to stand across the path that the company was taking. At the left of this high range rose 3 peaks. The tallest and nearest stood up like a tooth tipped with snow. Its great, bare, northern precipice was still largely in the shadow, but when the sunlight slanted upon it, it glowed red. Gandalf stood at Frodo's side and looked out under his hand. "We've done well," he said. "We have reached the borders of the country that men call Hollin. Many elves lived here in happier days when Eregion was its name. 45 leagues as the crow flies we've come, though many long miles further our feet have walked." Okay, so this is the night of January the 8th, so it seems like a good time to look back at the map, showing the group's progress from Rivendell over the last fortnight. Here we can see the map from Rivendell, over the ford of Bruinen, and journeying over the rough terrain of the eastern Trollshaws. It took the Fellowship 14 days to complete this section of the journey until they scaled the Hollin Ridge on January the 7th, leaving the Trollshaws behind them. Then if we look at this map, we can see the rest of their progress into Hollin, where they then camped atop the Hollin Ridge on January the 8th, with the mountains rising up in the distance. Gandalf told the group that they should make for the Dimril Dale, which they can reach by climbing the pass known as the Redhorn Gate on the far side of Caradhras, which we can see over to the east of this map, as well as the foreboding kingdom of Moria below it. At dusk the company set out, and turning now half east, they steered their course towards Caradhras, which far away still glowed faintly red in the last light of the vanished sun. One by one white stars sprang forth as the sky faded. Guided by Aragorn, they struck a good path. It looked to Frodo like the remains of an ancient road that had once been broad and well planned from Hollin to the mountain pass. So as I mentioned earlier, this land used to be known as Eregion and was settled in the Second Age by the Gwaith Imirdain, or the people of the Jewelsmiths, which were a group of elven master craftsmen who were responsible for creating, among many things, the Rings of Power. They enjoyed a far closer relationship with the dwarves, who had the nearby kingdom of Khazad-dûm, than was typical for their race. The land was sacked by Sauron in 1697 during the War of the Elves and Sauron, though there is still a number of elven ruins that can be seen here. Holly trees became common here in later years, which led to men referring to the land as Hollin. For 2 more nights they marched on, climbing steadily but ever more slowly as their road wound up into the hills, and the mountains towered up nearer and nearer. On the 3rd morning Caradhras rose before them, a mighty peak tipped with snow like silver, but with sheer, naked sides, dull red, as if stained with blood. With the weather swiftly deteriorating, and Gandalf fearing that the Redhorn Gate was being watched, he determined that they had to make 2 swift marches to reach the top of the pass, once again travelling by night. The company set out again, with good speed at first, but soon their way became steep and difficult. The twisting and climbing road had in many places almost disappeared, and was blocked with many fallen stones. The night grew deadly dark under great clouds. A bitter wind swirled among the rocks. By midnight they'd climbed to the knees of the great mountains. The narrow path now wound under a sheer wall of cliffs to the left, above which the grim flanks of Caradhras towered up invisible in the gloom. On the right was a gulf of darkness where the land fell suddenly into a deep ravine. Laboriously they climbed a sharp slope and halted for a moment at the top. Frodo felt a soft touch on his face. He put out his arm and saw the dim white flakes of snow settling on his sleeve. They went on. But before long the snow was falling fast, filling all the air and swirling into Frodo's eyes. The dark, bent shapes of Gandalf and Aragorn, only a pace or 2 ahead, could hardly be seen. When they were halted, the wind died down and the snow slackened until it almost ceased. They tramped on again, but they had not gone more than a furlong when the storm returned with fresh fury. The wind whistled and the snow became a blinding blizzard. Soon even Boromir found it hard to keep going. The hobbits, bent nearly double, toiled along behind the taller folk, but it was plain that they could not go much further if the snow continued. Frodo's feet felt like lead. Pippin was dragging behind. Even Gimli, as stout as any dwarf could be, was grumbling as he trudged. The company halted suddenly, as if they'd come to an agreement without any words being spoken. They heard eerie noises in the darkness round them. It may have only been a trick of the wind in the cracks and gullies of the rocky wall, but the sounds were those of shrill cries and wild howls of laughter. Stones began to fall from the mountainside, whistling over their heads or crashing on the path beside them. Every now and again they heard a dull rumble as a great boulder rolled down from hidden heights above. "We cannot go further tonight," said Boromir. "Let those call it the wind who will. There are fell voices on the air, and these stones are aimed at us." The company now gathered as close to the cliff as they could. It faced southwards, and near the bottom it leaned out a little, so that they hoped it would give them some protection from the northerly wind and from the falling stones. But eddying blasts swirled round them from every side, and the snow flowed down in ever denser clouds. They huddled together with their backs to the wall. Bill the pony stood patiently but dejectedly in front of the hobbits and screened them a little, but before long the drifting snow was above his hocks, and it went on mounting. If they had had no larger companions, the hobbits would soon have been entirely buried. A great sleepiness came over Frodo. He felt himself sinking fast into a warm and hazy dream. He thought a fire was heating his toes, and out of the shadows on the other side of the hearth he heard Bilbo's voice speaking. "I don't think much of your diary," he said. "Snowstorms on January the 12th? There was no need to come back to report that." "But I wanted rest and sleep, Bilbo," Frodo answered with an effort when he felt himself shaken, and he came painfully back to wakefulness. Boromir had lifted him off the ground out of a nest of snow. "This will be the death of the halflings, Gandalf," said Boromir. "It is useless to sit here until the snow goes over our heads. We must do something to save ourselves." And that's where we'll leave the Fellowship for this part of Frodo's journey. Here's a quick look at that map again, showing the route that the company took over the last 4 days, until, as Frodo himself just mentioned, January the 12th. Thanks for watching the video. If you've enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the Talking Tolkien channel, where I'll be continuing Frodo's journey as the Fellowship consider another route to reach the Dimrill Dale.